history of children's books and wondering what makes them the way they are today and how they've really changed over the years. And I was really inspired by the fact that we're doing the Alice in Wonderland tea this year also, which is in June. And I was just thinking about the influences over time that children's books and literature in general have had on each other and that the world has had on literature. Alice in Wonderland as a story has always really interested me. I always thought growing up that it was super unique that for the time period it was written, it was totally out of nowhere. It was like a non sequitur of literature. And I actually found in my research, especially in the reading of this book right here, that it completely was not. It actually is very much a product of the time. But there is a very big reason as to why Alice in Wonderland is so enduring, why it was so popular, and what made it so important to literature. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Part of the reason behind that is because Lewis Carroll was a commercial genius. His promotional skills were very good for the time period. But I'm not just focusing on Alice, of course. I'm also going to be talking about children's history, or children's book history as a whole, as you can see from the kind of timeline that I gave you. And you can already see, just looking at that timeline, that there are a lot of books that clearly influence one another, that are very similar in their themes, and you'll kind of see that as I go through. But really, if you made a Venn diagram of the who influenced who of children's literature, it's going to be a mess. It's a jumbly spider web that every children's book critic of the last 200 years is going to be very disagreeing on. So I try to kind of condense that into a small presentation to give you the most important stuff. So we're going to start with the earliest children's literature. So we start with Aesop's Fables. These are basically the oldest stories in existence that have been marketed towards children. Of course, they were not initially that way. They were really initially more for adults. They appealed to adults and to moralists and to preachers. Aesop was a Greek slave that lived between 620 and 564 BC, and his fables actually weren't put to written record until about 300 years after he died. So I don't know who kept them all in the conscious memory or had them, but they weren't published until then. And the first English version wasn't even published till 1484, so good 1,000+ years after that. But the most well-known of those, of course, we have The Hare and the Tortoise, or though most people today call it The Tortoise and the Hare. And The Goose That Laid the Golden Egg, which is a cautionary tale about greed. The Boy Who Cried Wolf, about the dangers of lying. So again, we see these really early children's books that have very strong moral centers to them, and that was kind of the point of the books. But again, the stories were not for children. Children's literature was not a thing until much, much later. So pre-16th century, there were no books written for children, and the genre of children's literature did not become an established genre until the 18th century. The earliest children's books were didactic, so that's a word, it's kind of a buzzword here. It just means they had a lesson, essentially. Now, before the 18th century, the concept of childhood also did not really exist as a separate thing. They were just little to-be adults. So they were teaching them how to be functional members of society. Now, the Americans, of course, when we're getting into the 15th and 16th centuries, were extremely Puritan in their beliefs, and everything was very focused on Christianity and religion. And that's why some of the earliest American children's books were very religious. So this is the first, what's considered to be the first children's book published in America. In 1646, it was called The Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes by John Cotton. And it was a 15-page catechism that contained 64 important questions about the proper way to live so as not to anger God, essentially. And so, on here we see questions like, are you born a sinner? And when, or what is your corrupt nature, and things like that. And so this was a much more condensed version of the one that they gave to adults, which was, of course, much larger and probably even more, the way that is. So moving ahead a little bit, so we're eventually going to see this move from instruction to entertainment. And a lot of that is largely due to this guy right here. His name is John Locke, and he published an essay called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. And that really introduced this concept of what's called the tabula rasa, which means blank slate. He developed this idea that children are essentially completely blank slate when they're born, and that everything that comes to them is going to influence the way that they develop. So obviously that is totally pushing away the concept of nature over nurture. So he proposed that without rules is how a baby is born, and they are formed by one's sensory experiences. He proposed the concept of easy and pleasant books to develop the mind for children, and he was one of the first people to actually suggest that we make children's books have pictures in them, which is, why we have so many now. So this is one of, if not the first children's book to have illustrations in it, and it's called The Orbis Pictus, and it was published in 1658 by a guy named Comenius. It's an encyclopedia basically for children that has a picture, and there's a translation into Latin and German of each object on there. And it was translated into English about a year later in 1659. And this was used in homes and throughout schools for a very, very long time. So definitely an enduring piece of literature. Now, another person I didn't mention was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was another philosopher of the time who argued that children should be allowed to develop naturally and joyously, and he was very against the strict idea of parenthood that they had at the time. Then there was this guy, John Newbery. If you've ever heard of the Newbery Medal, the Newbery Honor, this is where that comes from. He is considered to be the father of modern children's literature because he was the first person to really take the concept of children's literature and make it entertaining for kids more than anything else. So he wrote this book called A Pretty Little Pocket Book intended for the instruction of Little Master Tommy and Pretty Miss Polly. It's a little bit of a mouthful. That was in 1744, and essentially this was the McDonald's children's toy of the time. Because it's this book and it comes with either a pincushion or a ball, and it was intended for a boy or a girl. So the boy would get the ball and the girl would get the pincushion. So I think that was a very early model for McDonald's to develop that. But they would stick a needle in the ball on different sides depending on if they did a good deed or a bad deed. So it was still in its own way very didactic, very meant to teach kids right from wrong, but it was still much more kind of whimsical and more playful than other stories of that time. But yeah, the Newbery Medal each year is given to outstanding works in children's literature in America, which I find a little ironic considering Newbery was very English. So I don't know why they decided to use him, but that's how it went. So of course, as we go on, we see the development of fairy tales, and everybody knows these fairy tales, everybody's very familiar with them, and that's because in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, fairy tales were everywhere. They were super, super popular, and it totally pushed out anything that was realistic. People did not like that, especially in the early 19th century. So of course, the biggest players in that were the brothers Grimm. They collected traditional fairy tales mostly from Germany, such as Aschenputtel, which is Cinderella. I don't know if I'm going to say this right, Rotkäppchen, which is Little Red Riding Hood, and Rapunzel. So their first set of stories was published in 1812, and it was a collection of 86 stories. And these first collection of stories were actually very highly criticized because they had a lot of sexual stuff in the nature, and they also had a lot of on-parent violence, which was very frowned upon at that time. So that is how you end up with a bunch of fairy tales that are about step-parents, about the stepmother, because they were originally about the mom, but they were like, you have to honor thy mother. So we're going to take that out, we're going to make it the stepmom. It's okay if you're mean to the stepmom, because she's not your real mom. So they rewrote it with all those changes, but if anything, the rewrites were actually more violent. They added in more violence, especially when it came to punishing the bad deeds of the villains of the story. So if you're not at all familiar with the original Cinderella, it is extremely violent. It ends with the stepsisters and the stepmom getting their eyes pecked out by birds. It's super violent. They actually cut off parts of their feet to fit into the shoes. So it's pretty intense. And of course, all these stories that we know are very Disney-fied in today's culture, and you'll see that with a lot of fairy tales, also those of Hans Christian Andersen. So he was another person, he traveled Europe, collecting these stories, and of course, Little Mermaid is probably his most well-known story. Again, the Disney version is way more optimistic than the original version would have been. And that's really interesting to see how we've developed over the years of kind of saying what a child can and cannot handle. The people who made the Little Mermaid film obviously thought that they could not handle Little Mermaid dying at the end of the story. And that is exactly what happened at the original story. So another big one that was popular at the time, although it was written way earlier, was The Tales of Mother Goose. And that was collected by Charles Perrault, which was actually around the 1600s, but again, it became super popular in the 1800s. Now, this development of fairy tales led to the big popularity of books about magic objects and talking animals, and you can kind of see where I'm going with this as we move forward. Now, I kind of want to take a step to the side and explain something that you might not expect. Obviously, this is not a children's book. Mark talked to me before the talk, and he was like, I'm curious to see how On the Origin of Species is a children's book. And the answer is it's not. It was actually just extremely influential to children's literature at the time. So, Charles Darwin had a major effect on mid-19th century children's literature. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859. And this was the Victorian introduction to the concept of evolution, of course, natural selection, and this idea that nature is extremely harsh and unforgiving. And that's something that they were not used to. They were previously very much of the idea that nature would bend to the will of man. And that, you know, if animals and nature were at man's command, essentially. And the religious groups of the time actually highly feared the collapse of society because of this publication of this book. They thought that without morals, without the divine laws, that man would just kill each other and everything would just collapse. So there's a lot of fear at this time. There's a lot of people trying to make sense of these new concepts, and science and literature and these kind of things have always affected one another, of course. So a really good example of that is this book called The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. This book is very strange, and it's actually, it was published right around the same time as Alice in Wonderland, and it is kind of similar in a lot of ways. It basically depicts the moral and physical evolution of the protagonist. The protagonist is a little boy who falls in a river and drowns, and he turns into what's called a water baby. It's a mystical creature, and he's going on this journey through physical changes that he's also learning about himself with. And this was one of the first books of this time to kind of suggest that this concept of evolution and the concept of religion can coexist. That they were not mutually exclusive, which was a big fear of a lot of people at the time. However, critics really say that this book was more for adults than it was for children. It was about a child, but it was not for children because it had a very heavy theme of this evolution versus religion concept. But it's generally accepted as a product of, and response to the changing structures of nature, faith, and childhood in the Victorian era. However, this book did not stay as popular as Alice in Wonderland for a number of reasons. One is, of course, the commercialism that we see through Alice, which I'll explain in a bit. The book did not have that, and also this book is extremely racist. It has a lot of very racist depictions of different groups. So yeah.
I read that when I was a child, and it was the illustrations. The children are naked, so that it was taken out of many libraries.
Yeah, exactly. This book, you will not find this in libraries now, and definitely not recommended for your kids now. It's not a kid's book, and again, it has a lot of very outdated descriptions of different types of people. So that's a big book for this time period. And then, of course, we have Alice in Wonderland, which does not directly discuss the ideas of evolution, but you can really see this concept of evolution playing into the story. So Alice, if you're familiar with the story, she changes size multiple times throughout the book. She's also relocated into this world where human superiority is constantly challenged. Her social roles, her society expectations are constantly confronted by the animals that she sees in the story. So Darwin's influence on the Alice stories is a very deep and heavily explored kind of concept, but I will not go too much into that now because it's a whole nother thing that I could spend a whole nother hour on. So, okay, so now we finally get to Alice. Alice in Wonderland is an 1865 book by, of course, Lewis Carroll. Of course, his real name was actually Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. He was a mathematician, a poet, a professor. He worked for Oxford University, and he was really close friends with the dean of Oxford University, and his name was Henry Liddell. And Henry Liddell had 3 daughters. They were Lorena, Edith, and Alice. So, of course, immediate red flags. There's this adult man who is really close friends with these 3 girls. There have been a lot of, like controversy surrounding his relationship with these girls. For the most part, we're pretty sure it was mostly he was just friends with them. He was friends with their dad, but he did take a lot of pictures of them. So that was something that he did do. But in any case, he was very heavily influenced by them, especially in his writing. So it actually is a poem that describes how Carroll came up with the idea of Alice in Wonderland. So the poem is from the perspective of a man riding in his boat. He's with these 3 girls named Prima, Segunda, and Tertia, 1, 2, 3. And they beg the speaker to tell a story while they're on the boat. And that is exactly what happened and how he came up with Alice in Wonderland. Now Alice, who was 10 years old at the time, begged him after the boat ride to please write down this story. We love it so much. And that's exactly how you get the book. So the original plot, I think most people are pretty familiar with it. Pretty simple. She falls down the rabbit hole into Wonderland after chasing the white rabbit. But it's also extremely confusing. There's a lot of very confusing scenarios that happen. It's essentially Alice from one weird situation to the next, just trying to make sense of what she's experiencing with these weird characters. And of course, it's the introduction of such iconic characters as the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, the Queen of Hearts, the Blue Caterpillar. All of those characters, we all know who they are. They're very well known at this point. Now, Alice is a proper Victorian child, and she is trying to apply her logic to every situation in this world and becoming increasingly frustrated by the world's indifference and at times adverseness to her propriety. But the moral of the story is really ambiguous, which is surprising because a lot of other texts at the time, the author would actually explicitly state the moral at the end of the book, especially that water baby story. They'd be like, this is what you had to get from the book. And if you didn't, then obviously you didn't read it right. But Alice didn't do that. Its primary purpose was to entertain children, and that was really what it did, and that's part of the reason why it was so popular. And it was markedly absent of religious themes. It did not have any religion in it whatsoever, despite the fact that Carroll was himself a Christian, and he was pretty religious, but he was a lot quieter about it than some other people at the time. So the big question when it comes to Alice in Wonderland is, did Alice in Wonderland actually change the world of children's literature? Did it come out of nowhere? Was it completely different? Or was it just a product of the time? And the answer to that question is it's a little bit of both. This book right here, I don't remember the exact title, but The Place of Lewis Carroll in Children's Literature, that is a scholar's interpretation of how Alice in Wonderland did not, in fact, change the world of children's literature. In fact, it very much was perfectly placed where it was. He argued that at the time, no critic saw the book as having a special significance when it first appeared, and that it largely owes its popularity to the wood-engraved illustrations of John Tenniel, a major and well-established cartoonist of the time. So these pictures that are in the book are actually the major reason that this book became so popular. And the impact of the book was a lot more gradual. And part of the biggest reasons for that is because Lewis Carroll was a huge snob. He did not want to market this book to poor children. He only wanted to make it affordable for rich kids. In fact, he said, he was quoted as saying that he didn't think poor children would like his book. And he didn't see any reason to make it cheaper, to make it more accessible. And you can imagine how much bigger it would have gotten so much faster if he had allowed that, more access to his book. Now, Carol wrote the book intending to just be another fairy tale, so it really is just another fairy tale book. And he actually makes a point of mocking traditional learning methods that a lot of other books had at the time. There's a character called the Mock Turtle, which I don't know if you can see it very well, it's right here. This turtle has like a cow head, basically. And the Mock Turtle in the book actually says, what is the use of repeating all that stuff if you don't explain it as you go on? And that was kind of a jab at the learning methods for kids at the time, that they only learned things by endlessly repeating them, and they never actually learned the substance of what they were saying. It also pokes fun at the dramatic consequences given to children in fairy tales. So, for instance, Queen of Hearts, of course, we all know, off with their head. She is constantly threatening to cut people's heads off. And that, again, is just kind of a way of Carol saying, these old fairy tales, the kids always die in really horrible ways, and this is just kind of a funny way to poke fun at that. But the true enduring quality of Alice in Wonderland lies with Lewis Carroll's commercialism. So this is actually the first edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You can see that this image here is actually of the Cheshire Cat. There were other versions of it that had this image with Alice holding the little pig baby. And he was the first person to recognize that people do judge a book by its cover. If you see a book that's more visually appealing, people are more likely to buy it. And that is a huge reason for his success. So he was one of the first people to popularize the use of the dust jacket as well as a promotional tool. So we see over time, because this is another really important thing, the Alice in Wonderland books have constantly changed with the time. Their appearance morphs to the culture around it. And a lot of books have done that, classics, but I don't think any of them are quite as obvious as this story. So this is the 1898 cover. You see the 1920s cover, 1950s, and you're seeing this really dramatic change in the appearance of these books. 1967, and then finally there's a 1990s cover. So it really does adapt to the art of the time. And Carroll actually even made a nursery version of Alice in Wonderland himself, which had color pictures in it of the original Tenniel drawings. But another huge thing that Carroll recognized that made this book so popular was his use of conversations and the illustrations. And he knew that kids loved to read people talking more than they liked long-winded descriptions. And that is a big thing that Alice in Wonderland has. If you've ever read it, you know that most of this book is Alice talking to other animals and trying to make sense of what they're saying. Now, we'll see a lot of influence of Alice throughout the years as children's books are changing. So one of the biggest things that Alice has a lasting influence on is the use of nonsense in literature. So nonsense is this idea that challenges logic, it challenges adulthood, it challenges civil life. And one of the biggest inheritors of this concept was the Dadaists. Dadaism is an art movement that took place as a response to World War I. It's this idea of nonsense as a counterculture, trying to make some strangeness out of this world that is so serious and so full of violence. Other inheritors of that nonsense concept were Theodore Geisel, or Dr. Seuss, as most people know him, and Shel Silverstein. A lot of Silverstein's poetry is especially very heavy in that nonsense concept. Another important concept that Alice kind of influenced in literature is this idea of philology, which is basically the influence of literature on language. So we see we see Carroll's poem, The Jabberwocky, and if anybody's familiar with that, it is full of words that aren't real. You just kind of have to use context clues to figure out what these words mean. And that's a really good example of using the literature to affect language. And other authors that have very famously done that are Tolkien. Tolkien wrote, of course, The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings books, and he developed an entire language just for that book, the Hobbit, or not the Hobbit, the Elvish language. So that's a good example of that. Another big influence Alice had was on the development of the coming of age story. Kids that are going through hardships to become more mature, more capable, and we see these throughout, the entire century and a half since that book. Catcher in the Rye is a good example, and then more modern examples, The Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, Harry Potter, of course, and these are just books that, show these kids becoming adults through the hardships. And then another big thing that Alice influenced was the existence of the female protagonist. Believe it or not, that was pretty unheard of before Alice in Wonderland, and this is another, obviously, very big fantasy female protagonist that we know from literature, which is Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. So this is some of the original art and the original cover of that book, which very similar to the Alice in Wonderland illustrations. So we're kind of moving into the golden age, following the Civil War and moving into the late 19th century. This is what's considered the golden age of children's literature. So some of the major books that come out during this time were Little Women, obviously by, Louisa Alcott. Yes, I'm sure most of you knew that. So this is a time when coming of age books are very popular. This book actually established the genre of realistic family books. So in the late 19th century, we're kind of getting away from the fairy tales, and it's kind of coming back around to the realistic books. We're seeing kids' first books where children take on more serious matters that normally adults would have. So we also have Tom Sawyer was another really big one in 1876. There's another one that I will touch upon briefly. In 1880, it was called Uncle Remus, His Songs and His Sayings by Joel Chandler Harris. This was an extremely controversial book, especially now, but it was a best-selling collection of African-American folk tales. Controversial because of its depiction of African Americans by a white man. It was, it's worth mentioning because it was a bestseller at the time. It was extremely popular, but of course its legacy is a little touchy today. Then there was Treasure Island in 1883, The Wizard of Oz again in 1900, Wind in the Willows in 1908, Anne of Green Gables also in 1908, and Peter Pan, The Little Princess, Secret Garden, all of these really major classics that we're seeing coming out in this golden age. And so, moving into the 1900s, we are met with the beginning of World War I. And during World War I, as we know, England is very much involved in that, and it does not have a lot of time for the publishing of children's books. So between the beginning of World War I and the beginning of World War II, there's an extreme lull in publishing of kids' books. But there are some exceptions, such as Winnie the Pooh, which came out in 1926. I love the original illustrations, they're so cute. Mary Poppins, we have The Hobbit, which came out in 1937. The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White, which came out in 1938. And then, of course, Puffin Books is an English company. They started mass-producing paperbacks around the 1940s. So we see a really big increase in the amount of children's books being purchased and consumed at that time. In America, across the ocean, of course, their demand for children's books was ever increasing. Through the end of the Civil War to today, it has only gone up. And that is really because right around the early 1900s, there was a huge influx in the amount of libraries that were in the country, and they were becoming much more widely available. So another really big book around this time would have been A Little House in the Big Woods. It was the first book of the Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and that was about American frontier life. So that was very fascinating, especially to the people in Europe. I thought it was really interesting. And then there was also, I think I saw it on Mulberry Street by Dr. Seuss. That was the first one that he wrote in 1937. Again, it has some outdated things in it that today are a little controversial. Oh, I forgot to put that one in. Then there is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which was published in 1950. So really interesting, really quick aside, J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, if you didn't know, were really good friends. They actually both went to Oxford, or worked at Oxford at the same time, and they were part of this literary discussion group called the Inklings. So if you ever see or notice similarities between The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and The Lord of the Rings, there is a lot of that because they were talking constantly and they were very influential on each other's work. So there's a lot of that there. This book right here, The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats, was published in 1962. And this was the first picture book featuring an African-American protagonist to win a major children's book award. Where the Wild Things Are came out in 1963. And then we have somebody who has one of the strongest connections to Carol, I would say, is Roald Dahl. His books are crazy similar to Alice in Wonderland. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is probably his most well-known work. It was published in 1964. He shared an affinity for dark humor, nonsense, caricature, and the unexpected that Carol had. The villainous adult enemies of Dahl's books are very reminiscent of Victorian fairy tales, particularly that he always makes his villains very ugly, and that is very similar to Alice in Wonderland and a lot of the other fairy tales of the time. And they were both adapted, interestingly, by Tim Burton into movies, so Alice in Wonderland and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And that's kind of a good connection to see that they both carry these same similar dark themes that Tim Burton, who's known for making dark films, kind of adapted. So today there are a million authors and aspiring authors who are influenced by Carol's work, and the stage for new literature now is bigger than ever, so it's really hard to kind of narrow down things to talk about. But I think this is a really major one that's very obviously influenced by Alice in Wonderland. Neil Gaiman wrote Coraline in 2002. A girl finds an upside-down fantasy world, kind of the opposite of hers, through a tiny door, and that is very Alice-esque if I ever heard it. And then, of course, there's Harry Potter. Harry Potter is influenced by centuries of fairy tale figures, literary tropes. You see a lot of similarities and a lot of things mentioned that have been in the Brothers Grimm and that kind of thing. So children's literature today is much more diverse. Alice today probably would be much more enjoyed by adults than kids. I think if a kid were to read it, they would probably need the help of an adult to understand it, or at least, you know, it depends on the age, of course. Preteens would probably be the first age, I would say, to really get something out of the book. And today's books are much more heavily divided by age. The Victorians, they had nursery books and children's books, and that was it. They didn't have the 0 through 2, 2 through 5, the different dividers that we have now. So as we're just going through here, so children's books today, they can range from the purely comical and absurd. So like Dragon Glove Tacos, from what I've read about this book, it doesn't have any morals. It's just a goofy, fun book that kids really love to read. To the socially conscious, so we have Malala's Magic Pencil, written by Malala Yousafzai, I think is how you pronounce her name. And that is, of course, about the ability of one girl and her writing and her influence to change the world around her, and it's very inspirational for kids. To the charmingly didactic. So we still have kids' books today that are teaching lessons and morals. Like Lily's Purple Plastic Verse, for example, is a really charming little book that kids love. And the key to getting kids to take in these morals is these cute pictures. So children's books today can be used to teach subjects that kids might otherwise find unapproachable or boring, such as a children's book used to introduce kids to history, for instance. So, yeah.